join with Democrats to support the measure. We may also see work on the defense programs bill and executive nominations remain. And now live to the Senate floor here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order, and the Chaplain, retired Admiral Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. God of peace, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, thank you for coming to our world with the gift of salvation. We praise you for forgiving our sins and canceling the penalty which stood against us. Help our senators to be peacemakers as they move toward the finish line of another year. Lord, may they be filled with a knowledge of your will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, leading lives worthy of you as they strive to please you. Infuse them with the spirit of your peace and grace so that there will be peace on earth, goodwill to humankind. We pray in your majestic name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to count number 243.
Clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 243, S. 1356, a bill to amend the Workforce Investment Act of 1998, and so forth, and for other purposes.
At 10 a.m. this morning, Mr. President, there will be a roll call vote on the motion and vote cloture on the motion to concur in the House message to accompany H.A. Res. 59, the budget resolution. I would note the absence of quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Mississippi.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection, and under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is my understanding that at 10 a.m. the Senate will proceed to a cloture vote on the proposed budget. It's already been passed by the House of Representatives. The cloture vote will take 60 senators. If those 60 vote in favor, we would then move to a period of debate, pro forma debate actually, because the question would already have been decided. If members do not favor this budget, the time to register that opposition is this morning. And at 10 a.m. is the last chance to say no to this proposal and simply to send it back to the negotiators and ask them to do a better job. I rise this morning to reiterate my strong opposition to the House-passed budget, to the Murray-Ryan budget, and I do so for one specific reason. I would first interject there are many aspects of the budget that members do not like, that we're not overly delighted with. We realized from the outset that there would be compromises and unpleasant decisions that have to be made because when you find additional revenues, when you cut programs that are popular, it hurts and it is uncomfortable. And so I appreciate the fact that Senator Murray and Representative Ryan have made tough decisions, and apparently the House of Representatives on a bipartisan basis has agreed to go along. But my objection that moves me from undecided to a no is what this budget does to current and military retirees and the fact that it breaks a promise that has been made to military retirees for years and years. It does so retroactively, unlike it does to federal employees in the budget. And unlike this Congress directed on an earlier occasion when establishing a commission to look into retirement. What it does is for military retirees under the age of 62, instead of receiving the same cost of living adjustment that everyone else would be receiving, it cuts their COLA back to COLA less 1%. Now, why do we have a cost of living adjustment in the first place? The cost of living adjustment is designed to protect the purchasing power of a pension. And so when a young man or young woman joined the military, let's say 20 years ago at age 22, for example, they served for 20 years at least, and they're entitled to a pension under the law. That was the deal. And we agreed that also, once that pension was received and was in place, we would protect that pension against inflation each year by a cost of living adjustment. It's simply fair. It protects the purchasing power and the real ability of that pension to protect and support the retired military person and that person's family. What this budget does is go back on that promise. And it says to people who've completed their service, who've completed the full 20 years of their bargain, you may have done what we asked you to do, but now the government is not going to do what we told you we would do. We're not going to protect the purchasing power of your pension. And the first year we're going to cut that cost of living back 1%. And the next year, whatever cost of living there is out there, you get that less 1%. And it adds up over time, and I think members have been astonished to learn that an E7 retiring at age 40 today, that's an enlisted person at enlisted grade 7, retiring at age 40 today, would experience a loss of $83,000 in purchasing power over the course of the 22 years that pensioner would experience between age 40 and age 62. $83,000 in broken promises to our military retirees. An 05, an officer at officer grade 5 would lose some $124,000 lifetime. With this budget agreement, it is on the verge of being adopted. The only thing that stands in the way between our military retirees and this broken promise amounting to $83,000 for the typical enlisted person, $124,000 for the typical retired officer. The only thing standing in the way is this vote at 10 a.m. on cloture. 41 of us could say to the Senate, hold on a minute. We know we have a problem here, and we know we have an $80 billion package. But there's $6 billion of it here that's unfair to military retirees. We can do better than that. There are amendments that we would like to offer. There are amendments Senator Graham would like to offer. There's an amendment by Senator Ayotte, the distinguished senator from New Hampshire, that would eliminate this broken promise to our military retirees and pay for it with other savings elsewhere. Savings that have already been endorsed as good government and simply a matter of tightening up the enforcement of laws that are already there. We can find, my colleagues, we can find $6 billion elsewhere without breaking a promise to people who, during a time of the global war on terror, have stood forward, donned the uniform of the United States of America, and volunteered time and time again to re-up, to go overseas, place themselves in harm's way, and embark on a career in the United States military. We can pass a budget that accomplishes the goals of Murray Ryan without breaking this promise, and I so hope we will. But this is the time. 47 minutes from now is the opportunity we will have. After that, it's a simple majority. The deal will be done. The news accounts say that the debate is over, that the votes are already in. I would hope that somewhere, someone within the sound of my voice is realizing that this is just another example of the government breaking its word. And when we do this, when we tell falsehoods and change our minds and change our positions to the American people over and over and over again, what does that do to the confidence that the American people should have in this government, the confidence of their elected officials to do what we promised to do and to fulfill our side of an agreement? I implore my colleagues, Mr. President, even at this late hour, to take a pause, perhaps ask the committee, the conference committee, which I was a member of and which was not consulted in the end, to take another look at this, find the $6 billion in savings elsewhere, and fulfill our promise to the American people. One other point before I yield back, Mr. President. I just want to point out to you, a commission was established last year by Congress entitled the Military Compensation Retirement Modernization Commission, established last year. The purpose of this commission was to provide us with a comprehensive list of ways to make meaningful reforms to military pay and benefits. Members should remember that we specifically told this commission it could recommend any option as long as it grandfathered in those who currently serve and those who are currently retired. That was the sense of the Senate. That was the sense of the Congress last year. And I think this is one reason why military retirees are so surprised by this reversal, so surprised that we would be on the brink of changing the rules in the middle of the game, because we specifically said only last year that we would not do such a thing. I hope we'll honor that promise, and there's yet time for the Senate to do so. I urge a no vote, strongly urge a no vote for this reason on the cloture vote, which will begin shortly. And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
An active day expected in the Senate today as lawmakers continue work on a federal budget package. Senators are preparing to vote on a test vote on whether or not to move forward on the measure. 60 votes are needed, and it'll be interesting to see which senators cross the aisle to support the measure. We will be watching for that. Now, should this test vote get the needed votes, 30 hours of further debate would be in order. Some of those 30 hours could be given back, however. It is expected that lawmakers will use up all the time, resulting in a vote on final passage probably sometime tomorrow. Now, also today, we could see work on the defense programs bill and debate on a number of executive nominations, including Janet Yellen to be the new head of the Federal Reserve. So again, that key vote on the budget set to take place at 10 a.m. today. As you watch, you'll see that we keep a vote tally, and for you, we'll do that all the way through final passage. While we wait for further action here on the Senate floor, here's a look at some of the debate on the House floor as they worked on the bill last week.
On behalf of the bipartisan budget agreement, this is the first time since 1986 that a divided Congress has done what we are about to do. Here's what the bill does. It reduces the deficit by $23 billion, it does not raise taxes, and it cuts spending in a smarter way. We take temporary across-the-board cuts and we replace them with targeted permanent reforms. And these reforms, they take place immediately. First, we cut waste. For instance, we stop paying Medicaid bills that deadbeat dads ought to cover. We stop sending unemployment checks to criminals. Second, we go after corporate welfare. We eliminated a government program for energy companies. We eliminated a special carve-out in the student loan program. Third, we start to address the real problem, and that is autopilot spending. We ask new federal employees to contribute a little bit more toward their retirement. We ask private companies to cover a little bit more of their own pension guarantees. These savings build up over time, and this bill saves more than if we did nothing. This bill isn't as far as I'd like. It's not near the breadth and the scope of the budget that we passed earlier. But that's how it works in divided government. That's the nature of compromise. In a divided government, you don't get everything you want. But I think this bill is a firm step in the right direction. It's not perfect. It's a start. That's how it works in divided government. I also think, Mr. Speaker, it gives us the added benefit of preventing Washington from this lurch from crisis to crisis. We're bringing stability to the budget process, and that stability will help build confidence, and that confidence will help our economy. I'll be the first to admit we have a lot more work to do. I've been bringing budgets to this floor for 5 years that balance the budget, that pay off the debt, that reform our entitlement programs. That's what we want to do. That's what we are going to keep working on doing. But in this divided government, we're going to take the steps we can take, and this step we think is one in the right direction. We need to help strengthen the economy. We need to help create jobs and in take-home pay. The bottom line is, this first step is designed to help improve people's lives. It's designed to make this government work at a basic functioning level. And by passing this, we will reduce the deficit. We came here to get something done. We always lock horns. We always argue. We never agree. I think it's about time, for once in a long time, we find common ground and agree. And that is what this bill does. And that is what I ask my colleagues to consider and support this agreement. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start by commending my friend and colleague, Chairman Ryan, for working on this bipartisan agreement. And I also want to congratulate our Senate colleague, Senator Patty Murray, Chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, for her efforts to get this done, along with many of our colleagues. This agreement is far from perfect. It is not the budget agreement I or many of my colleagues would have written. But I do believe that on balance, at the margin, it represents a small but positive step forward. Mr. Speaker, I would not have been able to say that as recently as this past Monday and early Tuesday, but as a result of changes made, I think this is a positive step forward. And I want to commend my fellow conferees in the House side, Mr. Clyburn and Ms. Lowy, as well as the efforts of Leader Pelosi to make the changes necessary. As a result of those changes, this is an agreement that many of our colleagues can now support. And that is for many reasons. But most of all, it results in a situation where we will avoid the very deep and harmful cuts from the sequester, which, if this Congress does not act, will automatically take effect a few weeks from now. And those very deep and unproductive across-the-board cuts will create an unnecessary drag on the economy at a time when economic growth is building but still not nearly where it is. It will have a negative impact on job growth, and it will eat away at important national priorities and investments. As a result of this agreement, in fiscal year 2014, we will be able to invest $25 billion more in vital national areas than we were in fiscal year 2013. Of those $25 billion investments, $22.5 billion will be in important areas of domestic investment, in areas of education, in areas of important scientific research like medical research at the National Institutes of Health. It will also provide, as Chairman Ryan has said, some certainty, which is very important at this point in time. And without this agreement, you would be guaranteed additional furloughs of federal employees in the coming year. So I think it is a positive step forward. I do, Mr. Speaker, want to express my extreme disappointment in one area. The agreement itself, as Chairman Ryan has acknowledged and Senator Murray recognized, decided not to include what we call the doc fix, and it decided we would not include unemployment insurance compensation extension. Many of us argued that we should include both of those in this agreement. In fact, House Democrats proposed an agreement along those lines. We believe that if we're going to do the doc fix, which we think is important, making sure that Doctors who provide services to Medicare patients are fully compensated. We should also make sure that individuals who are on long-term unemployment will not be left out in the cold 3 days after Christmas. It was decided that those elements would not be in the agreement itself, and yet last night at the 11th hour, the House Republican majority decided to insert the doc fix within this agreement. We support that doc fix, but we are very troubled that we've not even been allowed a vote to extend unemployment compensation. But the reality, Mr. Speaker, is even without that, if we leave here without this agreement, we're not going to get extension of unemployment insurance because the Speaker won't allow us to have a vote on that. So the only thing we would accomplish by defeating this budget agreement would be to go home with a lot of uncertainty and with the sequester guaranteed to hit in January. That is not a good result. This agreement is a better result. I'll talk a little bit later about what we believe we should be doing in this Congress. As the Chairman said, this agreement doesn't match his vision, nor does it match ours. And we put forward a proposal that would focus a lot more on job creation, to try and invest more in our national infrastructure, in our roads and our bridges and our broadband, so that we can put people back to work right now and accomplish important national priorities. We believe we should be focusing on early education, investing more in our future so we have job growth not only now from additional investments, but we ensure greater job growth in the future. There are other things that we think were important and part of this agreement, which are not in here, but we will continue to fight for in the days ahead. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker, this time I'd like to yield 4 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Rogers from Kentucky.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 4 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. H.J. 59, the Ryan-Murray budget agreement. First, I want to commend Chairman Ryan on achieving a resolution to our immediate budget challenges. It takes a good deal of courage. It takes persistence. It takes dedication to reach a bipartisan agreement such as this. And I want the chairman of the Budget Committee to know that we deeply appreciate his hard work on our behalf. Great job. While everyone might not like everything in this bill, it is the best product that is achievable right now, and I urge that it be passed. As our budget chairman has said, this agreement reflects a compromise in policies, but not in our conservative principles. Not only does this deal hold the line on spending, it actually puts a dent in our annual deficit, a very significant accomplishment. Plus, it opens the door for future progress on the problem of runaway entitlements and paves the way toward budget and economic stability for the next 2 years. The legislation before us will also accomplish several other critically important goals. First and foremost, it will turn off the potentially devastating $20 billion sequestration cut to our national defense. Even if Congress provided what flexibility we could, which isn't much, a cut of this magnitude would cripple readiness programs and leave us all at risk. Second, this bill will allow Congress to avoid another shutdown showdown and help us return to regular order. As I've said many, many times before, the best way to trim spending, ensure wise investments of taxpayer dollars, and provide stability for our government and our economy is to do appropriations bills on an annual basis, each one separately brought to the floor, as the Constitution intends. This budget conference agreement will now permit bicameral negotiations on the fiscal year 2014 appropriations bills to begin, allowing my committee to get to work and make the hard, thoughtful, responsible, line-by-line funding decisions that are Congress's duty to make. It's important to remember that this is just the first step in the current budget process. My committee will now begin to negotiate and craft an omnibus appropriations bill that will fund the government for the rest of the fiscal year with the goal of completing it before the end of the CR January 15th. The omnibus will reflect the budget outline that is the Ryan Murray bill before us now and will make the hard choices to implement this budget agreement into actual funding levels. Mr. Speaker, this is a good bill. It makes a significant first step to putting us on a more stable and responsible fiscal path. Again, I want to commend the chairman, the ranking member, and all the members of the conference committee for the hard work, difficult decisions that they had to make to bring this bill to us now. I urge our colleagues to support it. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to my colleague, friend, and the gentlelady from Maryland on the Transportation Committee, Ms. Edwards.
Gentlelady from Maryland is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the gentleman from Maryland, my friend and my colleague, for all of your work in getting us to this point. To my friend, also Chairman Ryan, for getting us to this point, and to all the conferees. I am in support of the Bipartisan Budget Act. Though I support the agreement, it isn't the bill that I would have written. It's not the bill that I would have written to fully protect federal employees, today's employees and future employees. It's not the bill that I would have written to protect 1.3 million Americans who are about to lose their emergency unemployment insurance, 22,900 of them in Maryland just at the holidays. It's not the bill that I would have written that would reduce cost of living adjustments for our nation's military retirees. It's not the bill that I would have written to protect the commuter tax credit. But you know what? I didn't write this legislation, Mr. Speaker. It's a compromise. It's a negotiation. It's not perfect, but I support it. The agreement does ensure that federal employees, current federal employees, will get their cost of living increases this year. They won't face the uncertainties of furloughs, and they will face stability for the next couple of years. This compromise rejects the draconian proposal in the chairman's budget that would have made federal employees pay 5.5% more for their retirement at a cost of $20 billion, but that's not in this bill. This agreement does roll back sequestration cuts using spending cuts and new revenue. And the agreement increases non-defense discretionary spending by replacing almost 2/3 of this year's cuts, bringing the funding to $77 billion above the Republicans' preferred budget levels. The agreement doesn't cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid benefits, not by a single penny. What the agreement does is it allows Congress in this nation to get out of the dysfunction and the obstruction and to get on to the other business of protecting the American people, perhaps allowing us to focus on unemployment insurance extension, immigration, infrastructure investment, and all of the things that it takes to protect our economy. I support this legislation. Let's get on with it. And with that, I yield.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
I will give myself 3 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, just so that my colleagues understand what exactly this bill does or does not do, I want to walk you through a chart. In 2011, Congress passed the Budget Control Act. That set discretionary spending at this level up here, the blue line. It said that this thing we commonly call the Super Committee was supposed to go and cut $1.2 trillion out of mandatory spending, autopilot spending, the non-discretionary part of the budget, the big, fast-growing part that Congress rarely addresses. And if it didn't happen, then the sequester would kick in. That's this red line. That's where we are now because the sequester has kicked in. And what we face in January is another round of sequester cuts, $20 billion, that hits solely on defense spending in the military. A lot of us are concerned about that. When we have 85% of our troops, our brigades, are not ready, that's a problem. When we have people in Afghanistan and we need to reset our equipment and we're not where we need to be, that's a problem. That's a concern of ours. But what we do not want to do is lose any of the fiscal progress that was made by this act. In fact, we want to go farther. So what this bill does is it says for this rest of this half fiscal year 2014, and the upcoming fiscal year 2015, it changes discretionary spending to go to $1,012 billion and then $1,014 billion back on to where we are with the sequester. Okay, what does all that mean? It means that 92% of the sequester is still intact. For the next year and a half, this bill preserves 70% of the sequester, but we pay for that 30% that is given back. Let me explain what that means just in a quick dollars and cents sense. This bill achieves $85 billion in mandatory savings, the things we talked about a minute ago, all those various permanent spending cuts. It gives back or relieves from the sequester $63 billion in spending, half to defense, half to domestic spending like Mr. Van Hollen was talking about. The result is a net deficit reduction of $23 billion. So from the Budget Control Act of 2011, this advances fiscal responsibility to the tune of $23 billion. To put it this way, another way, 2 years ago when we passed the first House Republican budget, when we came into the majority, the appropriation number we were looking for then was $1,019 billion. Then in 2012 in the next House Republican budget, the appropriation bill we were fighting for then was $1,028 billion. Giving myself another minute to explain.
Gentleman's recognized for one additional minute.
The Budget Control Act would have had us at $1,058 billion. This agreement puts us at $1,012 billion. Under this agreement, we would not hit that discretionary spending number of $1,019 billion, the one we asked for 2 years ago. We wouldn't hit that number until the year 2017. So with respect to a fiscal track record, we're ahead of schedule. And we are replacing some of these across-the-board spending cuts that are indiscriminate, that don't set priorities, that treat the efficient and inefficient programs the same, with smarter permanent spending cuts in the autopilot part of spending, that part that Congress all too often ignores. Mr. Speaker, this is good government. It's also divided government. And under divided government, we need to take steps in the right direction. And to make divided government work, you can't ask each other to compromise a core principle, because we don't do that here. We ask each other to find some common ground to advance the common good, and that's what this agreement does, and that is why I ask my colleagues to support it. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think this agreement is an acknowledgement, at least a majority on both sides, certainly on the Democratic side, a strong majority, that the sequester is a dumb and unproductive way to cut spending or to reduce the deficit. What this agreement does is prevent that full sequester from taking place over the next 2 years. We believe that we should address and substitute the remaining sequester through a balanced approach of additional targeted cuts. But, Mr. Speaker, we also think we should close some of these special interest tax loopholes that benefit nobody except certain narrow interests that sometimes have undue sway here in the Congress. But as my colleague said, we have different approaches, and our Republican colleagues have refused to close a single one of those special tax breaks or preferences for the purpose either of reducing the sequester or reducing the deficit. So we have different approaches. We wouldn't have chosen the offsets that are in here to pay for the sequester replacement. They are the result of a negotiation. But as I said earlier, I believe on balance this is an important step forward, and one of the people who was very important in this process was my good friend and colleague from New York, the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee and one of the conferees, Ms. Lowy.
How much time?
2 minutes, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlelady from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the budget deal is a breakthrough in a difficult budget year and a dysfunctional Congress. As with any compromise, there are elements I oppose, Yet this agreement should help us do our jobs for the American people and end the shutdown standoffs. It provides some relief from the devastating impact of the sequester cuts on our economy and American families. Keeping sequestration in place through fiscal year 2014 would cost up to an estimated 1.6 million jobs. Now, the House and Senate must restore regular order to craft bills that instead create new jobs and protect important priorities like medical research, security and infrastructure upgrades, and early education. This agreement restores over 60% of the sequester on non-defense discretionary spending in 2014, restores those bills to roughly the FY 2013 enacted pre-sequester levels. It would hold defense funding levels roughly consistent with the 2013 level after sequester. The bill before us includes elements, frankly, I don't like, fails to address others it should. First, I am deeply upset that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle insisted on extending the 2% sequester on Medicare providers for an additional 2 years as part of the package's offsets. We should not extend their sequester burden. It is also unconscionable that the deal does not extend long-term unemployment benefits. Even with the progress our economy has made since the depths of the recession, there are still 1.3 million fewer jobs today than 6 years ago. 4 million Americans have been looking for work for more than 6 months. More than 1.3 million of them, 30 seconds.
I yield the gentlelady another 30 seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized for 30 seconds.
More than 1.3 million of them will lose their benefits, and for some, the only income they have, just 3 days after Christmas and 3 days before the new year. Today's bill will provide some economic certainty about fiscal policy over the next 2 years, which should boost growth and job creation. Because we cannot continue lurching from crisis to crisis, and despite my misgivings about the extension of Medicare provider cuts and failure to address long-term unemployment, I will vote yes.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Latham, for the purposes of a colloquy.
The gentleman from Iowa is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will yield the 2 minutes to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to enter into a colloquy with the gentleman from Wisconsin regarding the not-for-profit student loan servicing provisions in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013. Is it your understanding and intent that the not-for-profit servicing provision in this act does not require the termination of existing federal loan servicing contracts of any not-for-profit services who are currently servicing federal loans? And is it the further understanding and intent of the gentleman from Wisconsin that the Education Department will continue to enter into contracts with not-for-profit servicers based on their performance?
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Yes, it is the legislative intent that existing contracts to use the services for not-for-profit services are not terminated by this bill, and that they will be permitted to compete with the Department of Education's Title IV services for additional accounts. I yield back to the colleague.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield?
I yield to the gentleman from Iowa.
I rise to associate myself with the comments of the managers, and am pleased to note it is their intent that the use of non-for-profit servicers continues, and that not-for-profit servicers will be permitted to compete in the future for additional accounts. And I yield back to the gentleman from Vermont.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield?
I yield to the gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank the gentleman. I also rise to associate myself with the comments of the managers, and am pleased to know it is their intent that the use of not-for-profit servicers continues, and that not-for-profit servicers will be permitted to compete in the future for additional accounts. And I yield back to my colleague from Vermont.
And I yield the balance of my time.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 3 minutes to a good friend and colleague, one of the conferees who worked with us to move this agreement to a place where it was supported by many of us on the Democratic side, the Assistant Democratic Leader, Mr. Clyburn.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me thank my friend, Mr. Van Hollen, for yielding me this time, and I want to thank him and Ms. Nita Lowry for the tremendous work they did in keeping this effort moving forward in a very positive way. I also want to thank Chairman Ryan for the great work he has done on this and the manner within which he got his work done. We don't talk a whole lot on this side of the Capitol about the other side, but I also want to thank Senator Patty Murray for all of her work. I had the great privilege of working with her on the super committee, and we didn't get much done. I was on the so-called Biden group along with Mr. Van Houten, and we didn't get anything done. But I'm pleased at this time of year to say that the third time seems to be the charm. This is not the product that I would have written if I were writing it, and I'm sure that it's not the product that any of my Democratic colleagues would write. I'm always concerned about the Meat Act's approach to dealing with the budget. And so this effort takes that away and allows us to approach spending in a way that is much more conducive to running the government. We didn't get everything, and nobody gets everything they want in trying to reach common ground. But it's important for me to note at this time some things that were taken off the table. There are no cuts to Social Security. There are no benefit cuts to those on receiving Medicare or Medicaid. And there's no targeting of federal employees for additional cuts. And the relief from the sequester in both defense and essential services is very real and significant. It's also important to note what this bill does not do. And I am very concerned about the fact that we were not able to make unemployment insurance a part of this effort.
I yield the gentleman another 30 seconds.
Thank you. I am hopeful that when we get back here after the first of the year, that we will move and do as we have done in the past. Pass unemployment insurance, make it retroactive to January 1, so those people who find themselves unemployed for no fault of their own can find some relief going into the next holiday season. So, and thanks. Hopefully we'll do something on the minimum wage. These are things that I think we need to do coming back here after the first of the year. And I thank the gentleman for yielding me the time, and I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Wisconsin.
First, I'd like to yield myself 30 seconds. Just to respond to my friend, South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn. I want him to know that his time spent on these prior endeavors, the Biden group, all those, that was not time wasted. That was productive time, because the findings from those groups were used in this agreement. The work that they did on all of those policies were work that we borrowed from to put this together. So I want him to know that that was productive use of his time, which helped in turn produce this result.
Thank you very much. You're very kind.
With that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to our distinguished Majority Whip, Mr. McCarthy from California.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, I want to thank our chairman of the Budget Committee for showing the leadership, finding the common ground, but actually moving this entire House. When I first came to Congress, the debate was, always about more spending. Always
Yes,
about
for
what...
the vote. So I ask unanimous consent the senator get 2 minutes, and then and then be recognized.
Without objection.
2 minutes from this moment, I trust. So we went to conference, and the budget conference didn't meet. We didn't produce a budget conference. The conferees did not vote. Our leaders prepared legislation that's now before us that has a number of problems, in my opinion. It's not the right way to have conducted this process, but the question is, should we advance with this legislation, or does it need to be improved? I believe it can be improved. I believe it should be improved, and I believe legislation of this size and scope that actually amends the Budget Control Act of the United States that has successfully contained the growth in spending for a couple of years ought not to be lightly amended. So what lightly changed? So I would suggest that the right vote today would be to vote against cloture and to say to the leadership and Senator Reid that we want to have amendments on this legislation. We're about to have a significant reduction in the retirement benefits of disabled military personnel, people who've served 20 years in the United States military. Their pay is going to be cut as much as $70,000 for a staff sergeant over their lifetime. And we need to think about that. We also, this legislation amazingly and disappointingly has altered the ability of this Senate to block increases in spending. We have a budget point of order today that allows an objection to be raised to require 60 votes in order to spend more than we agreed to spend. This legislation amazingly takes that away. Perhaps the House didn't understand the significance of it, but it's very significant. We've used it 3 separate times to block tax and spend legislation within the last year or so successfully and help us stay with the commitment we made to the American people to keep spending at a correct level. So, colleagues, there are a lot of problems with this bill, but the only way to fix it will be to say to Senator Reid and to the leadership here in the Senate, the Democratic leadership, that let's slow down, let's give us a chance to have actual amendments, and let's fix some of the problems. And there's plenty of time to fix those problems, send the bill back to the House, and be able to pass it before the deadline of January 15th. I thank the Chair and would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, for the past few years here in Congress, we have lurched from one budget crisis to another, from one fiscal cliff to the next. When one countdown clock stopped, it wasn't too long before the next one got started. The uncertainty was devastating to our very fragile economic recovery. The constant crisis cost us billions of dollars in lost growth and jobs, and the continued across-the-board cuts from sequestration were hurting our families and our communities and cutting off critical investments in economic growth and national security programs. Mr. President, after the completely unnecessary government shutdown and debt limit crisis just 2 months ago, the American people were more disgusted than ever at the gridlock and the dysfunction. They were sick of partisanship, sick of showboating and saber-rattling. They were tired of turning on their televisions at night and seeing elected officials saying, "It is my way or the highway." And they had no more patience for politicians holding the economy and the federal government hostage to extract concessions or score political points. So when the government was finally reopened and the debt limit crisis averted, people across the country were hoping that Democrats and Republicans could finally get in a room, make some compromises, and take a step away from the constant crises. That is why I was so glad that part of that crisis-ending deal was creating the budget conference that many of us here on both sides of the aisle had been trying to start since the Senate and House passed our budgets 7 months earlier. Mr. President, the budget conference began at a time when distrust between Democrats and Republicans could not have been higher. We had just 2 months to get a deal to avoid lurching towards another crisis, and most people assumed there was no way the divide could be bridged. But Chairman Ryan and I got together, and we started talking, and we decided that instead of trying to solve everything at once, the most important thing we could do for the families we represented was to end the uncertainty and start rebuilding some trust. We weren't going to spend the next 8 weeks sniping at each other from our partisan corners. We were not going to use what was said in the room to launch political attacks on the other. And we weren't going to try to tackle the larger challenges we both know are critical, but weren't going to be solved right now. So we focused on what was attainable. We worked together to find common ground, and we looked for ways that we could compromise and take some steps towards the other. We both thought that the least we should be able to do was to find a way to replace some of the across-the-board cuts from sequestration and agree on a spending level for the short term so we could avoid another crisis. Now, I know some of our colleagues want to keep the sequester caps, but Democrats and many Republicans believe it makes sense to replace these meat axe cuts with smarter and more balanced savings. Mr. President, we spent 7 weeks working on this. I worked very closely with the House Budget Committee Ranking Member Chris Van Hollen, as well as my colleagues here in the Senate, on and off the Budget Committee. And I'm very proud that last week, Chairman Ryan and I reached an agreement on the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013. This bill passed the House of Representatives on Thursday on a vote of 332 to 94, with overwhelming support from Democrats and Republicans. And I come to the floor today to urge my colleagues to support this bill here in the Senate and send it to the President so it can be signed into law. Mr. President, the Bipartisan Budget Act puts job and economic growth first by rolling back sequestration's harmful cuts to education, medical research, infrastructure investments, defense jobs for the next 2 years. If we didn't get a deal, we would have faced another continuing resolution that would have locked in the automatic cuts, or worse, a potential government shutdown in just a few short weeks. Over the past year, I've heard from so many people across my home state of Washington who have told me sequestration has hurt their families, businesses, and communities. From the parents of children whose Head Start programs were shut down, or seniors wondering if Meals on Wheels would continue, the scientists and doctors whose investments in cutting-edge research and medical cures were cut off or threatened, the construction workers who lost their jobs when projects were put on hold, small business owners whose revenues were declining due to the cuts and the uncertainty, and so many more. For them, the cuts from sequestration were senseless. They were real, they were hurting, and they were only going to get worse. So I'm very proud that our bill replaces almost 2/3 of this year's sequester cuts to domestic discretionary investments. This won't solve every problem sequestration's caused, but it is a step in the right direction and a dramatic improvement over the status quo. Over the past year, I've talked to workers at Joint Base Lewis-McChord and Fairchild Air Force Base and elsewhere who have been very much impacted by the sequestration and very worried about how another round of cuts would affect their jobs and families. I've heard from military leaders who told me sequestration would impact our national security if it continued, and from companies that do business with the Defense Department that the uncertainty and the cuts were hurting their ability to hire workers and invest in future growth. So I am very glad that this bill would prevent the upcoming round of defense sequestration and provide some certainty for the Pentagon for the upcoming years. Secretary of Defense Hagel and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Dempsey have both expressed support for this bill, as have a number of colleagues here in Congress who spent the last few years highlighting the impact of continued sequestration on national security and defense workers. Mr. President, the increased investments we get from rolling back sequestration over the next 2 years are fully replaced with a smart, balanced mix of new revenue and more responsible spending cuts. Experts and economists have said the responsible thing to do is increase investments now while our economic recovery remains fragile and workers are still fighting to get back on the job while tackling our deficit and debt over the long run. This bill moves us in the direction of exactly that. We have cut our deficit in half over the past few years, and this bill adds to the $2.5 trillion in deficit reduction done since 2011 with an additional $23 billion in savings over the next 10 years. This bill isn't exactly what I would have written on my own. I'm pretty sure it's not what Chairman Ryan would have written on his own. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent for 3 additional minutes.
Is there objection? Hearing none.
Mr. President, this bill is a compromise, and that means neither side got everything they wanted, and both of us had to give a bit. I was very disappointed we weren't able to close